Hey there, everyone. Welcome back to Utility Sports. And in today's video, we're going to talk about the Minnesota Timberwolves in a continuation of our trade guide series here up on YouTube, where we talk about every single team in the NBA with a specialized, specific NBA team trade guide for each of those 30 teams. If you guys are new to Utility Sports, please hit that subscribe button and also leave a like if you do enjoy the video that you see here today covering those Minnesota Timberwolves, who just haven't had the season that I think a lot of people were hoping to see from them, especially after a big-time Rudy Gobert trade. So in this video, what we're going to look at, we're going to look at their current record, where they currently sit at the time I'm recording this. We'll take a look at those draft assets that they have, whether or not I believe that long-term cap space will play any role in any moves that they make this trade deadline. Quick disclaimer, it probably will not. Long-term cap space, gives us a good idea on whether a team could be a buyer or seller. A lot of the teams with open cap space typically are the sellers because they're the team looking to open themselves up to make some moves, and teams who don't have windows to be making moves in free agency often have to be buyers during the trade deadline season. We'll also then look at tradable players on the team, plus their contract situations. There's one player that really sticks out in particular for Minnesota this season. Of course, it's going to have to break up a little bit of a bromance, but something that I think they're going to strongly consider. Then we'll also look at possible trades for the Minnesota Timberwolves. I've got two specific ones that I think are realistic and possible to see this season, although there's definite possible outcomes out there that are not in those trades, which I'm going to talk about a little bit. There's a lot of room here yet for Minnesota to figure out some stuff. Tim Conley's been very aggressive in his tenure as a lead decision maker in the NBA. Look back at what he's done with Denver and Minnesota, of course, his short tenure there. He's been very aggressive in making trades, making moves. So it's very possible we see this team be active this trade deadline. So we'll conclude this video by talking about that projected activity level. What do I expect from the Minnesota Timberwolves? Do I expect them to make one move, two moves, multiple moves, no moves at all? I think that this is a very interesting team and one of the linchpins when it comes to trade deadline season. The Timberwolves, I think, are going to be at the center of some really important discussions. So I think it's going to be really pivotal to talk about this team for this upcoming trade deadline in 2023. When you look at the current record when I'm recording this team is 22-23, which is 9th in the Western Conference. They're a half game back of the 6th seed, 1 game ahead of the 12th seed. One thing about Minnesota, after losing their first game in a back-to-back to Denver and then winning their second game of the back-to-back at home against Toronto, this Timberwolves team's been really up and down this year, and I think those last two games really have shown that, where second night of a back-to-back, you'd expect, okay, maybe this team doesn't get the job done, and then they end up doing that and playing really well. But they've also had some peculiar losses this year where they blow fourth quarter leads. You look at the game against Denver, they melted down at the end of that game. On Monday earlier this week, they had an opportunity to hit a game winner out of the corner with Jaden McDaniels. He came up short on that shot, and unfortunately the Wolves just have not had the season that they've wanted to. Although they are in situations right now where you could see this team, if they get hot, end up avoiding the play-in completely, but also if they get cold at the wrong time, especially say when Karl-Anthony Towns comes back in, you have to reacclimate the entire team around those two bigs, which we've seen them already have some issues with early in the season. Do they fall and then completely fall out of the playoff race in general, including that play-in seeding? I think right now Minnesota's really kind of at a disaster point where things have not gone smoothly at all. I think Anthony Edwards really struggled to start the year. He's starting to pick up pace. Rudy Gobert has been left on an island by his coach. I don't think Chris Finch is doing him any favors. So the Timberwolves have struggled, and I think right now a lot of people are hitting the panic button on this team. But there's a lot of time left in the year. We are just a little bit over halfway. Minnesota could maybe right some of the wrongs that they have going on right now in terms of system, scheme. It's very late into the season to do some of that stuff, but I think it might be essential for this team to get to where they want to go this season. So when it comes to their draft assets, there's no tradable first-round picks here. Obviously, after trading for Rudy Gobert, this team does not have a first-round pick that they can trade. Now, they do own some firsts, but they're not tradable because of the step-in rule. Due to that, they are likely not going to be big-time buyers this trade deadline, but they do have some second-round picks. But when you look at their contracts, their cap table right now, they don't have a lot of movable contracts that make sense to move. Some of the players that you'd maybe look at that movable kind of salary range. You have guys like Kyle Anderson, Taurean Prince. Both of those two are very valuable wings for this team. We saw how important Taurean Prince was when he went down in late November and ended up missing pretty much the entire month of December. The Timberwolves had a disaster month without him. It's clear that they need wing play, and they can't afford to trade either of those two. So their draft assets are pretty bare at this point. But, you know, long-term cap space isn't going to bail them out either. It's just not realistic to see any cap space. They do have D'Angelo Russell on an expiring deal, so it's possible that, let's say he were to walk away in free agency, this team would be almost neutral in terms of cap space. Most of their money, though, is committed to both Rudy Gobert and Karl-Anthony Towns on big, long-term contracts. And because of that, it's not very realistic to see them make any moves using cap space. They'll have the non-taxpayer mid-level exception, which could be in the range of 3 years, $33 to $35 million, depending on how they front-load, back-load it. But they have ways to improve this roster marginally, but I don't think that there's any, you know, significant, wow, okay, this is going to completely reshape the franchise type of free agency move out there for them right now. So they're going to have to be creative here at the trade deadline. Like I said, no tradable first, only a few second rounders, and not a lot of players that are players you want to trade. So they have to kind of find a little niche here in the trade market that can maybe open the window for them to figure some stuff out long term. So we'll see how they go about doing that in my potential trades. I don't know if it necessarily solves the issues, but I do think that there are some things that they could address this trade market for sure. So are they a buyer or seller? Well, I think that really depends on the eyes of the beholder. You see, I have D'Angelo Russell here on the graphic, and that is intentional. D'Angelo Russell is, I think, a good guard in the league. I think he's kind of a combo point guard, shooting guard, where he can do some stuff off the ball that's very good, but he's very comfortable handling the ball in the pick and roll. He is a little turnover prone, though. I think that's been one of the Timberwolves' biggest issues. They rank in the bottom 10 when it comes to points allowed off of turnovers. And D'Angelo Russell's right at the center of that. So, you know, when I was looking at this team before the season, you guys know I was very high on the Timberwolves. I made a video on how I ended up being wrong about that. And, you know, some things just haven't clicked. I think they're, you know, a few decisions away from maybe getting to where I was hoping they would. But D'Angelo Russell's been a problem. So for the buyer seller, when it comes to how you categorize this team, some people are naturally high on D'Angelo Russell. You know, you see the highlights, you see some of the clips of him, and you say, wow, this kid's pretty talented. He can do a lot of stuff with the basketball. He's pretty good passer when he's, you know, working downhill. He sees the floor. And he's also a gifted shot maker, although that comes with complete inconsistency. Night to night, you don't know what you're going to get. Some nights you get 9 assists, 1 turnover. Some nights you get 5 assists, 4 turnovers. That's not really the kind of consistency you're looking for night to night in the NBA, especially when it comes to his shooting as well. There's nights this year where he goes 10 of 12 from the field or 11 of 13 from the field, and you think, okay, this is what D'Angelo is supposed to be with Rudy Gobert setting him massive screens. And then some nights he goes 4 of 12 or 4 of 14, and you're like, well, what D'Angelo are we getting tonight? So I think it really depends on which executive, which fan you're talking to about whether you would categorize Minnesota as a buyer or seller. If D'Angelo Russell were to be traded, some would consider them buyers moving off of D'Lo. Some would consider them sellers moving off of D'Lo. It's a very interesting situation. And one thing I do want to say, Minnesota's been really hosed by injuries this year. I know a lot of teams do struggle with injuries, and pretty much every single team has guys out of the lineup on a nightly basis. I think the Timberwolves have been a very extreme version of this. You'd think about Karl-Anthony Towns missing the longest stretch of his entire NBA career up to this point. Very bad luck for him with that calf strain. Rudy Gobert's been in and out of the lineup more than he typically is due to some nagging lower body injuries. And then D'Angelo's missed a little bit of time. Taurean Prince, like I talked about, missed some time. Kyle Anderson's been a little bit of in and out of the lineup. Jordan McLaughlin, who's a really important backup guard for this team, has been out of the lineup for an extended period of time. Minnesota's kind of ran into some bad luck, as well as kind of the difficulty of acclimating themselves to a new system, new scheme with Rudy Gobert in the building. So it's been a tough go for them, and I think D'Angelo Russell is kind of in the center of a lot of that as well. So when it comes to tradable players, there's really only one player that I look at this list of players on, and there's only one guy I really want to include here. D'Angelo Russell. He's on an expiring $31.4 million contract, which means with the 125% rule, you're looking at anyone from around $26 million to about $35 million when it comes to trading D'Angelo Russell for other players or singular player, which does make things a little complicated. It doesn't mean that there's a lot of options out here for you, but there are some definite options as well. And I think D'Angelo Russell, right now, if I had to give you a likelihood meter on D'Angelo Russell being traded, I would say roughly around 70%. Right now, I would say that D'Angelo Russell does not finish this season with the Minnesota Timberwolves. Now, it's very possible that he still does, right around that 30% threshold. And if he does, I would be kind of surprised if he's back on the team next year as he's heading toward free agency this year. The only way he's really going to stick around is if he, goes up to ownership and says, hey, I'm willing to stick around on a cheaper deal, something like 4 years, $80 million at about $20 million a year. A lot more friendly of a price point for him, slightly more than what Colin Sexton got with the Utah Jazz. That's kind of what the market should look like for D'Angelo Russell, hypothetically, in free agency. Now, there are some teams out there with cap space this offseason that maybe they do aggressively target D'Lo as a potential point guard option for them. I would be shocked if a team gave him more than 20 to 25 million a year, but you never really know. The market sometimes shakes up in, a weird way. It only takes one GM to overpay a guy. So it's very possible D'Lo could be looking at a bigger contract than that, but I think that sweet spot, 4 years, $80 million, is right around where D'Lo should be signing for next season. Potential trade number 1. This is a 3-team deal between the Miami Heat and the Utah Jazz, as well as the Minnesota Timberwolves. And as you can see here, we're swapping a lot of guards, right? And I think it makes sense for all parties involved here. The Miami Heat would be acquiring D'Angelo Russell. There have been numerous rumors that the Miami Heat could express some interest in D'Lo this year. Of course, the Kyle Lowry experiment has not paid off for them. Think about how far they got in the playoffs last year, 1 game away from representing the East in the NBA Finals yet again. It did not play out that way, though. They lost to Boston in that Game 7 in the Eastern Conference Finals, and since then, Kyle Lowry's been even worse. I think he's been a real disappointment in Miami since signing that contract with them. He's on a definite overpay when it comes to what that contract looks like financially. It really limits what they're able to do with their cap space and, their cap table in general. And think they gave up Precious Achiuwa and some other assets to get that done. Very, very tough situation for them, specifically given the fact that he just hasn't played up to standards. So Utah comes in here as the tanking team that I think that they're going to become this trade deadline. And they're going to go and take Kyle Lowry's contract here with the idea of getting a few picks as well. Maybe a protected first-round pick from Miami to get off of that contract, as well as potentially a second-round pick or 2 from Miami in this deal, just so that D'Lo can actually come into the fold. And, they're paying to get D'Lo, a couple second-round picks, and they're paying a first to get off of Kyle Lowry here. And for Minnesota, you're basically turning D'Angelo Russell into Mike Conley. And you might say, whoa, Mike Conley is nearly a decade older. Is he even better than D'Angelo Russell? The answer to that question is probably no. I don't think he's better than D'Angelo Russell. But when you look at this Minnesota team, some things are clear. They need a professional in the room. They need a veteran in that locker room. They need somebody who's been there, done that when it comes to winning. And quite frankly, D'Angelo Russell has never been out of the first round of the playoffs. You think back to his best year in the league, it was with a Brooklyn Nets team that, quite frankly, there was no expectations. There's expectations now in Minnesota. D'Angelo Russell's been really shaky and inconsistent, and I think Mike Conley would bring a positive, calming force not only to the court, but also to the locker room. I think that Minnesota, you look at the history of that franchise, they need somebody there who can be that calming presence, a good leader for some of those young guys, and we already know he works well with Rudy Gobert. We saw it in Utah for the past few seasons where Conley had a really good chemistry in the pick and roll with Rudy Gobert, found a ton of success, those two players, in terms of winning regular season games. Conley has really good chemistry in terms of feeding Gobert on lobs. D'Lo's learning some of these things. And of course, it's very premature into the relationship between D'Lo and Gobert to say it's not working. But you see some of the passes that D'Angelo Russell throws. I'm not just talking ones to Gobert. There's lazy passes all the time, whether it's from the top of the key, from the wing area. He throws the ball around like he doesn't care about it. Because of that, Minnesota is very susceptible to live ball turnovers, points off turnovers, fast break points allowed. And I think Mike Conley solves some of those issues as well as being a pro's pro when it comes to handling the media. He's not going to be sending out cryptic tweets. He's been pretty much every stop about Mike Conley. All I hear is he's a great teammate, great guy to have in a locker room. I think Minnesota needs a presence like that. So maybe you are taking a step back in terms of pure raw talent and you're getting older, but it might be for the better here for Minnesota, especially if you don't have to give up any draft picks to get off of an expiring contract here in D'Angelo Russell anyway. Then we look at potential trade number 2, and this is a fun one here, one that I think is significantly less likely than Miami's deal, but one that I could still see coming to fruition if Chicago hits the panic button on Lonzo Ball. For those of you who do not know, Lonzo Ball has not played an NBA game since January of 2022, and he still is experiencing knee discomfort when it comes to running, walking up the stairs, and those are major red flags for a guy like Lonzo Ball, who's on a multi-year deal. He's got 2 years left after this season at about $20 million a year. That's a pretty hefty price tag for a player who is roughly the same age as D'Angelo Russell. And quite frankly, there's a risk that he doesn't play 40-plus games again in a season. You look at the injury history he's already, went through and suffered. It's not been all, sunshine, rainbows, and roses for Lonzo Ball at this point of his career. Now, when he's been on the court, he's been an awesome, fantastic player who presents himself as a really good 3-and-D wing with playmaking feel. Yes, I said wing. Just because you bring the ball up the court does not mean you're a point guard. And I think ultimately Minnesota doesn't need him to be a point guard. I think that they find a healthy balance with him being a connector in their offense. Minnesota's best offense this year, best 5-man lineup this year, has really included Kyle Anderson for the most part, because Kyle Anderson's kind of that connectivity piece that a lot of teams in the NBA need and could really use. Lonzo Ball gives them another one of those this year. I believe Minnesota's most effective lineup has featured D'Angelo Russell, Anthony Edwards, Jaden McDaniels, Kyle Anderson, and Rudy Gobert. It's not a surprise there that they have playmakers in that lineup, as well as a talented scoring piece in Anthony Edwards, as well as a defensive stalwart in Rudy Gobert, who, when he's still, playing the way that he's supposed to, when he's getting utilized correctly, he's still a very, very good rim protector and somebody who does deter shots around the rim. Lonzo Ball gives you a better defensive presence than what D'Angelo Russell presents himself as, especially when Lonzo's on the court. To me, this is a no-brainer for Minnesota. You're essentially losing D'Lo for nothing potentially this offseason. You maybe take a little bit of risk here. Let's say Lonzo Ball's never healthy again. You kind of signed yourself up to a player that probably becomes immovable. But if the best case scenario plays out, Lonzo Ball, in my opinion, is a perfect fit onto this roster. Minnesota badly needs more three-point shooting as well. Lonzo has really proven to be a good high-volume catch-and-shoot three-point shooter early in his career since some of the changes he made since landing in New Orleans. This would be Lonzo's 4th team if he were to be traded. It's clear he's becoming somewhat of a journeyman already early into his career. Those injuries definitely do not help, but he is somebody who I still think holds a lot of value when he's on the court. Kobe White's in here to match money. For me, Chicago, I don't think that they're factoring Kobe White into their long-term plans. D'Angelo Russell could potentially be a decent fit into Chicago, and maybe Minnesota attaches a second-round pick or 2 here, but it really depends on how you value Lonzo's contract at this point. If Chicago's at all hesitant about Lonzo's future in the NBA, I think that they should strongly consider a deal like this. You're essentially upgrading from Kobe White to D'Angelo Russell. Now, if Lonzo has to pass a physical, it's possible that this deal would get nixed, and then Minnesota would maybe have to, get a second rounder back in return for themselves, like what we saw with Isaiah Thomas going to Cleveland back when Boston traded him for Kyrie Irving in 2018. There are some other potential trades too. I do want to highlight potential moves for a guy like Fred VanVleet from Toronto. I do want to highlight maybe a Duncan Robinson deal where Robinson comes in as a movement shooter that Minnesota could badly use. I know Duncan's not playing well this season, especially from the three-point line, but a player like him, with the volume, the way that he shoots the basketball, those percentages are going to, skyrocket, and they're going to dip at some points. I think that he would easily be the best shooter for the Minnesota Timberwolves on day 1 of his tenure there. I think that they're badly missing Malik Beasley, who is having a really great and underrated season in Utah this year. There's that weird dynamic between Minnesota and Utah where why would the Jazz want to help out Minnesota right now? in terms of a Mike Conley trade, they might look at it and say, hey, we're prying away a 26-year-old, giving them a guy who's well into his 30s, and they're taking maybe a long-term approach on how good that pick in 2026, 2028 might be for their actual long-term future. Justin Zanuck, Danny Ainge are playing all their cards right. When it comes to the projected activity level now for Minnesota, I'm going to label them a one-move wonder. And what I mean by that is I think Minnesota's got one play to make this trade deadline, and that's a D'Angelo Russell trade. Like I talked about, they don't have the flexibility here to trade guys from their rotation. Right now, their rotation's already pretty thin. You know, they've gotten a lot from Austin Rivers on a minimum contract. I think he's one of the more underrated players in the league, especially when it comes to his actual contract number on a vet's minimum. Definitely a great signing by Tim Conley this offseason, but they're just thin. They can't afford to give up, like I said earlier in the video, Kyle Anderson, Taurean Prince. They obviously cannot trade Karl-Anthony Towns because of the rules on his Supermax extension. Doesn't make sense to trade Rudy Gobert right now. Anthony Edwards is not going anywhere. That would just be, insanity for Minnesota to even consider at this point. We also know that Minnesota really values Jaden McDaniels. So if there's going to be a move, it's going to be around D'Angelo Russell and his expiring contract. But I think that there's a lot to work out in terms of making something like that work. Does Minnesota have something up their sleeve? Maybe. I wouldn't completely rule out a Ben Simmons trade. Not that I think that's going to for sure happen, but I wouldn't completely rule it out either. I think Minnesota's got some things to definitely figure out between now and the NBA trade deadline. They're one of the weirdest teams to project right now at this point because of the limitations in terms of cap space, draft assets, a team that's struggling but wants to win, new ownership group. It's weird. I think right now Minnesota's in a really tricky spot. Tim Conley has to walk the tightrope here in terms of making the right decisions over the next 12 to 24 months. Because if he doesn't, he could be looking at himself, maybe on the chopping block at some point, which is really harsh to say because they just hired him 7 months ago. So right now it's a tricky situation. I hope that I'm coming across clear here that Minnesota is not in a favorable situation right now. Winning cures a lot of issues. If this team figures some things out and starts winning games, nobody's going to have a problem with Minnesota anymore. But at some point, they just have to start stringing wins together. They've been better in January than they were in December, no questions asked. But this is something we need to see sustained by them. It's very possible we still see this team in the playoffs this year. I think that's like the bare minimum expectation. Minnesota has to be a playoff team. Of course, they would love to make it out of the first round, something they have not done since Kevin Garnett was suiting up for this team in the mid-2000s. So there's a lot of room to go yet in terms of which way they could go up. There's a lot of room, though, that they can go down. So, that one move is going to be really, really important for the direction of this franchise, and I'm excited to see which one they potentially make at the NBA trade deadline. Hopefully you guys did enjoy this trade guide on the Minnesota Timberwolves. If you did, make sure to leave a like, subscribe to the channel for more content like this one. Let me know in the comment section down below who you think the Minnesota Timberwolves should trade for. This video was a lot of fun to record. Let me know what team I should also record next. We got a bunch of them up on the channel, so go check that out as well to see what team you haven't watched yet on the channel. And I'm sure you'll get some really good insight on what that team could potentially be looking to do, players they could be potentially looking to trade, and a whole lot more in those videos. Thanks, guys, and we'll catch you in the very next Utility Sports video.